بینندگان گرامی تلویزیون ایران تیوی، با 16مین برنامه تلویزیونی بیبا در 14 جون 2003 به پایان دوره اول برنامه‌هایمان رسیدیم. عده زیادی از شما احتمالاً موفق به دیدن این برنامه‌ها نشدند و نظر به درخواست پخش مجدد مجموعه برنامه‌های دوره اول بران شدیم که این 15 برنامه را برای شما بینندگان گرامی باز پخش نماییم.
سلام، خوش آمدید به 4مین برنامه بیبا. قبل از هر چیزی اجازه به من بدهید که سال نو را به شما تبریک بگم و آرزوی موفقیت، سعادت و خوشبختی بیشتر در این سال نو برای شما داشته باشم. از آنجایی که شاید تعدادی از بینندگان ارجمند ایران تیوی تا به حال برنامه‌های ما را ندیده باشند، اجازه بدهید توضیح مختصری از برنامه‌های بیبا به شما بدهم. من بابک امامیان، بنیانگذار British Iranian Business Association که به فارسی میشه انجمن مدیران ایران،
بینندگان گرامی تلویزیون ایران تیوی، با 16مین برنامه تلویزیونی بیبا در 14 جون 2003 به پایان دوره اول برنامه‌هایمان رسیدیم. عده زیادی از شما احتمالاً موفق به دیدن این برنامه‌ها نشدند و نظر به درخواست پخش مجدد مجموعه برنامه‌های دوره اول بران شدیم که این 15 برنامه را برای شما بینندگان گرامی باز پخش نماییم.
سلام، خوش آمدید به 4مین برنامه بیبا. قبل از هر چیزی اجازه به من بدهید که سال نو را به شما تبریک بگم و آرزوی موفقیت، سعادت و خوشبختی بیشتر در این سال نو برای شما داشته باشم. از آنجایی که شاید تعدادی از بینندگان ارجمند ایران تیوی تا به حال برنامه‌های ما را ندیده باشند، اجازه بدهید توضیح مختصری از برنامه‌های بیبا به شما بدهم. من بابک امامیان، بنیانگذار British Iranian Business Association که به فارسی میشه انجمن مدیران ایرانی مقیم انگلستان و به کوتاه ما به خودمون بیبا میگوییم. پس از 9 سال فعالیت دائم در انگلستان، بیبا به خوبی در انگلستان شناخته شده است. علت تهیه این برنامه معرفی بیبا به دوستان عزیز ما در آمریکا است، به این امید که این باعث روابط اقتصادی بین ایرانیان مقیم انگلستان و آمریکا بشود. برنامه امشب اختصاص دارد به گفتگویی با لورد پیتر تمپل ماریس، عضو مجلس اعیان انگلستان و ریاست محترم بیبا. من توضیح درباره این مسئله به دوستان ما در آمریکا بدم. سیستم پارلمانی انگلستان به 2 قسمت است. یک قسمت House of Commons هستش که در آمریکا شما به House of Commons میگید Lower House یا House of Representatives یا به فارسی میشه مجلس عوام. قسمت دیگه ما در اینجا بهش میگیم House of Lords. در اونجا شما بهش میگین یا Upper House یا Senate یا مجلس اعیان. لورد پیتر تمپل ماریس عضو مجلس اعیان هست. پس اگر ایشون در آمریکا بودن، ایشون الان میشدن سناتور پیتر تمپل ماریس. امیدوارم این نکته برای دوستان ما در آمریکا روشن شده باشه که چی هست، که به چه صورتی هستش. حالا ما در بیبا بسیار خوشحال هستیم و بسیار مفتخریم که لورد پیتر تمپل ماریس از سال 1995 ریاست دیبا رو پذیرفته است. حضور لورد پیتر تمپل ماریس به عنوان ریاست دیبا نه تنها باعث دلگرمی در همه زمینه‌ها بوده است، بلکه در مراکز اقتصادی انگلستان ارزش، اهمیت، وزنه و اعتبار خاصی برای دیبا داشته است. حال می‌پردازیم به مصاحبه امشب با لورد پیتر تمپل ماریس. در قسمت اول این مصاحبه ایشان درباره سفر طولانی خود در سیستم پارلمانی انگلستان و دلایل و چگونگی راهیابی از مجلس عوام به مجلس لردها یا مجلس اعیان سخن میگوید. Lord Peter Temple Morris, thank you very much for being our president at British Iranian Business Association. You've been extremely kind to us for the last 7 years that you've been our president. I don't know how to thank you, because when we started at the beginning, we were a small operation. We're not a huge operation right now, but you were very generous to us.
Much. I mean, I had absolutely no hesitation. I thought it was a very commendable idea. I thought the whole business of bringing Iranians together, successful Iranians in Britain, all engaged in businesses all over the place, many different interest areas, but they have their Iranian selves in common, was a great thing, and I think you've made a great success of that. You've gone from strength to strength, and it really is a privilege and an honor to be your president.
But when we started at 7 years ago, then you were a member of British Parliament, you were an MP. Now you are a Lord. You are a Lord of the Second Chamber, House of Lords, a member of House of Lords. We know how you became an MP. You become an MP by being an elected person. How do you become a Lord? What is the process of becoming a member of the Second Chamber, House of Lords?
Well, one part of it, of course, is a long career in the House of Commons, and if you have a long career and you make a contribution in various different ways, which I did, over a period of no less than 27 years, and I lost count of how many times I was re-elected to the House of Commons. It came eventually to the election of 2001, 2 years ago. I decided to stand down, because enough was enough, really, and in terms of age, whilst I'm not exactly elderly, I'm not in the prime of youth anymore, I wanted to go whilst I was on top. And just before I went and retired, before the general election, the Prime Minister contacted me and invited me, if I so wanted, to go to the upper house. The Prime Minister of the day has what's called a dissolution honours list, in which he honours a number of members of Parliament who have given good service, shall we say, to the public and to the House of Commons. And therefore I was one of 25 that went up from that intake, all the retirees that were retiring. I was one of 25, and I've never regretted it. It was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, most MPs, when they retire, don't get the opportunity to go to the upper house. But I was appointed. The nice thing about it is that because it's still the House of Lords, you are made a baron, believe it or not. I don't feel particularly feudal, but nevertheless, I'm made a baron, but for life. I'm not made it for any hereditary reasons, and therefore my children will not become barons after me. But nevertheless, I have all the rights of that for life. And for life, I am a member of the upper house, and that is a rare privilege. And then last but not least, I might say that the nicest thing for the old Commons people like me is that when you're made a member of the upper house, you then have the right by convention to use the whole building. And what that means is I can go to meetings in the House of Commons if the Prime Minister gets into difficulties within the Labour Party and is not having an easy time just at the moment, then Lord Temple Morris is entitled as an ex-MP, as well as a peer, to go to all those meetings. I can use all the restaurants, I can use the House of Commons terrace and general facilities. That's a rare privilege, really, and it means that you have the run of the whole building, both the upper and the lower house, in terms of facilities, and also to go and see your old friends and find out the gossip and what's happening politically.
But you still have a lot of political power, because you still can vote and delay legislation from House of Commons. So.
Oh, you have quite a lot of power and influence. I mean, the influence, particularly, the amount of expertise that is in the House of Lords is very formidable. I mean, I remember when I made my maiden speech, which was on the Middle East and also referred to Iran, but I had at least 2 foreign secretaries very close to me in the speaker's list. I had a former chief of the General Staff. I was congratulated by an ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer and also by an ex-permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, so that you are at a very high level. So what is said is extremely valuable and is taken note of. And in addition to that, of course, we have the expertise to look at the legislation. That is the very serious part of our work. And in addition to that, you're in a wonderful position, which MPs can't always do because they're so busy, to go out and about, to be president of BIBA, for example. I mean, it's much easier for me to do that and similar things in the House of Lords, to play a role. And over and above all that, I might add, I have the same access to ministers as I had in the Commons, so that if I need to make a case for anything or anybody, then as a peer I can go through and ask to see anyone from the Prime Minister down, and that's a rare privilege.
Lord Tempermont, I'd like to go back to what you earlier said, which is very true, that you are one of very few selected to be a member of House of Lords and have these unique privileges and power. I'd like to know, what qualities do you think you have that surpass you from your other peers, your other colleagues, to get in this position?
Well, basically, I think by your service and by your career, you have to stand out in some way. Very often it's just through offices held. Ex-senior ministers, by tradition, have a right to go to the House of Lords. They almost automatically suggest themselves. It gets more complicated when you have people like me that had a long parliamentary career in the House of Commons. But then you see, with the various things that I did over that long time, particularly in the field of foreign affairs, I was chairman of the British group of the Interparliamentary Union, and in that capacity I led a number of initiatives. One of those was that I formed and eventually hosted the very, very important visit of Mikhail Gorbachev to the United Kingdom in 1984. In 1990, I, after a lot of work, founded the British-Irish Parliamentary Body. That body, through bringing the two parliaments together, played a leading part in the peace process. I was responsible for the first contact after the Falklands War with Argentina. I led the first delegation officially after the Iranian Revolution to Iran. I mean, I could go on, but there was a whole load of these sort of things, so that when it came to choosing a peer, I was very eligible. And I would only add to that the fact that I very much was very not only friendly with the Prime Minister Tony Blair, but I refused to accept the Conservative Party's European policy. Was invited to join the Labour Party, and although I say it myself, I made a success of my years with the Labour Party as well. So for me, you have two for the price of one. You have a left-wing conservative, if you like, who became disenchanted with that particular political party, was then accepted by, and I think made a success within the Labour Party, because otherwise there is no way that they would have made me a peer. So I like to think that I earned it, as it were, and indeed I'm enjoying it.
Well, I have to say you're a role model to me, and I'm sure so many others, because you stood on your principles. You did not just follow the party line just because for the sake of it. You stood on your principle, and I really cherish that as a person, and I follow that up. And I hope I could always be like you. But I'd like to come back to House of Lords. Now, this is especially interesting for us and our audience in the United States. Since their second chamber, House of Senate, is an elected second chamber, ours here is a selected one, and it is perhaps ironic, the mother of world democracy and parliamentary system. It's still its second chamber being a selected one, and there's nothing wrong with it. It has operated extremely well. I personally put it down to the British persons of play. But then, how do you feel about that? That still, in our great democracy here, we still have a second chamber that is selected rather than elected. And how does it compare to the one in the Senate in the United States?
Yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I was 27 years in the House of Commons, and the House of Commons is paramount in terms of my political thinking, and therefore I would not want it challenged. It's a very special place, and indeed it performs, I think, a very worthwhile task, even if it might occasionally be criticized. And I'm dealing now with the House of Commons. Therefore, if you reform the Lords, and there's a lot of talk about Lords reform in this country at the present time, you must not do it in such a way that it will challenge or clash with the House of Commons. And that's where your appointed chamber comes in. Or if it's not going to be wholly appointed, then perhaps there's a case for some indirect election, so that you can have industries and trade unions and lawyers and doctors perhaps nominating and or electing their own representatives to come into an upper house. But the trick is, I think, with us, is that it must be complementary to the lower house and have something that the lower house does not have. Now, going on to the United States, the United States is completely different. Its constitution was drawn up by the founding fathers. It was, although I say it myself, modeled and then written down, modeled on the British constitutional position of that time. And it involves, therefore, a writing down of the separation of powers. And you have the executive, which roughly the king, if you like, in the 18th century and in London terms. But the executive is separate from the judiciary and separate from the Congress. But the key thing here is that with the representation that you have on the Hill, you've got your individual representation of the districts, the congressional districts throughout the states of the Union, but you also have the state representation in the Senate on a basis of equality, symbolic of the equality of the union of states that have a lot of power unto themselves anyway. Now, that's a federal setup. We're not federal. We're comparatively very small. I don't think we need really to have that particular elaborate nature of constitution, and we don't have it anyway because we have parliamentary governance. Our Prime Minister is a member of Parliament. Our ministers are all within the House of Commons mainly, some of them within the House of Lords. It's totally different, of course, from Washington. And I think that when you have our system, you really need one house that is predominant. You don't really need the vast federal structure of the representation of the two houses.
در قسمت دوم این مصاحبه لورد پیتر تمپل درباره رابطه بخش خصوصی و بخش دولتی سخن میگوید. Thank you very much for that explanation. I hope our audience in the United States now understand the difference between the centralized system and the federal system, where they are more of a federal system, and here we are more of a centralized system, and both work extremely well for respective countries. Now, going back to yourself, sir, you've been a public sector servant, and you've done a fabulous job, and you've helped people in private sector. Could you tell us about being in public sector? Because for people like myself, who've always been in private sector, we have this different idea about public sector.
Well, I think that being a politician is not really a very good example. I'm speaking now to your business people in California or wherever. It's not a very good example of the public sector. I mean, it's dog-eat-dog par excellence, and more so than probably most private sector companies. We also have the inconvenience of having to be re-elected every 4 years or so that therefore we can never relax and never sit back. On the other hand, of course, you are a public servant, and you are part of the wider public sector, but you've got very little security, and indeed I like to think of myself always, as well as being a member of Parliament, as a lawyer. I mean, I was always a lawyer. I didn't always practice because I didn't have time, but I knew that immediately anything went wrong, I could go straight back to the private sector. And now I've come into the upper house, so I'm still, as it were, a public servant, but I'm also part-time a lawyer here in London, consulting to a law firm. So I've always had a foot in the private sector. Now, dealing with just a direct answer to your question, rather than just the politicians as part of the public or the private sector, I mean, I think that your general public sector employee over the years, and it doesn't exist now. Mrs. Thatcher took a broom and swept out a lot of these people. They tended to be very comfortable and very cozy, and nothing ever very much happened. And it is true to say also that in the years after the war, particularly in Britain, I think that a number of private sector companies also were far too laid back, far too conservative, far too much let's have a nice lunch and a gin and tonic and so on, and we'll go and see how the men are doing afterwards. I mean, now everybody has a lunch in the same canteen. It's a very much more different type of thing in the private sector. But there was a public sector mentality which was across this country, which is no more. Nobody now, as I say, is so relaxed that they have a job for life. And almost daily on our television sets we see firms, for one reason or another, normally no direct fault of theirs, going into liquidation, bankruptcy, or phases of unemployment. It's all very, very sad. However, that is the internationalization of the world economy. We're now in for competition. So this old business of public sector against private sector, I think we're all in competition now, would be the moral that I would give to it. And insofar as we do have a public sector, it increasingly is one of administration. It's the civil service and the administration that goes with it, and with government bodies of one sort and another. That administration has increasingly to be watched. And that is where politicians and committees, I think, come into the picture, because they have to, I think, very closely look at the administration and make sure that it's not going to sleep, and make sure it's delivering to the people. So at that level, I think we always have to watch that there's not too much go slow and sleepiness on the public sector, but it's very, very different now to what it was.
But who leads who? Is it the private sector that leads, or the public sector? And nowadays, in private sector, we believe it is the scientists and the technologists and the industrialists who lead. Who leads in public sector, and overall, who should lead, the society or the country?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about it. You can have all sorts of complicated discussions about this. But I think that the elected leaders or otherwise of any given country are the ones that basically lead that country. There can be little doubt about that. I mean, I think that would we now be going to war in Iraq, for example, without President Bush and those immediately around him? We know, being in the trade, as it were, what their politics have been for years. And therefore, when they came to power, therefore we got a policy with or without 9/11, which was aiming very heavily at Saddam Hussein and Iraq. Now that's not something that is being dreamt up by some corporation somewhere. You then come to the role of the big corporations. And here, of course, you do get, depending on how, and this is another important point here, second point really, is how big the country is. It's all very well for me to talk, as I am, about the United States, or even like Great Britain and France and Germany. I mean, they're very established political systems with an established relationship with their private sectors and with their big companies. But of course, the smaller the country you get, the more your power is more diffuse, more difficult. Because you have the role of commerce coming in, the role of the big boys that want to come in and operate their commercial undertakings, very often in terms of the exploitation of that country for the purposes of its mineral wealth. And there, of course, the whole power balance becomes, and globalization becomes, that much more complicated. So finally, just coming back to the main Western power structures here, I think that whilst politicians lead, basically, and are elected to lead, increasingly with the huge multinational corporations that exist both within the United States and indeed right across the Western world, we do have a more complicated structure. And I think you always have to watch out for the money power, which is always there, riding alongside the political power. Because politics these days, modern politics, needs a lot of money. And of course that money can be donated by all sorts of interest areas. Therefore it has to be very, very strictly and tightly controlled, the whole question of contributions and patronage and everything. Because unless we're careful, you would find that money power might actually be carrying out a little bit too much power. As long as it's in the hands mainly of those that are elected to handle it, then I'm not over worried. But the system must be kept clean.
So what advice would you have for BIBA members who are the private sector? Yourself, a prominent person from public sector, what advice would you have for us? And also, what advice would you have for us into, now that we want to have more links with our friends in the United States?
Oh, I think from Viva's point of view, certainly in this country, in the UK, my advice always would be to do what most of them have done, actually, which is to make a success of their commercial lives. Bearing in mind that many settled here after 1979, many of them were quite young. Some of them lost an awful lot in coming here. The resilience of the people and the way that they have taken up another language, culture, and tradition, and now are increasingly, one after the other, are making a success of it, is something which I think they really need to be saluted for. I think it's a great, great success story which is increasingly being recognized here. And as far as I understand it, it's the same thing in the United States. I mean, there's so many Iranians have done so well right across the board of the different walks of life. So what I would say is that the challenge has been met, the first part of the challenge, which really is, without in any way leaving aside your old nationality. Most important, you're always proud of where you come from. But at the same time, you have adapted and you have made it. And my advice is to go on making it. You go on making it and you go on succeeding. At the same time, in never forgetting where you've come from, you do have, and this is perhaps the third point to make, a very good potential club. Now that one can relax a little bit, now that one is used to where one is living and one is succeeding, one's still Iranian. Who else is still Iranian? The answer is that an awful lot of bright business people, many of them at the prime of their working lives, are over here, and indeed only too anxious to have the common club connection with Iranian Americans who are doing the same thing. And I'm not talking now particularly about the old country, I'm talking about business generally, because most people are doing business quite unconnected with Iran itself. But being Iranian, knowing what you're getting, you may be as American as you can be in California, but underneath it is you're still an Iranian, and it's the same thing here. You may be very British, but underneath it you are an Iranian, and of course you would trust each other that much more easily, or certainly know what not to trust about each other that much more easily. I mean, you know what you're dealing with, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity now in the next phase to be able to exploit success on a more international basis.
در قسمت آخر این مصاحبه لورد پیتر تمپرماریز علت آشنایی خود و رابطه خود را با ایرانی ها با ما در میان می‌گذارد. Lord Peter, a lot of our audience are in enigma now that why should Lord Peter Temple-Morris be so much in love with Iran or Iranianness and so on. So could you please explain to our audience what is your connection, or what was your first connection with Iran or Iranianness?
Well, my first connection was going out exploring as a Cambridge student, really. And I went on a university expedition. And we went out in two vans. That was 1961, many moons ago. And it was just at the end of my time at Cambridge University. And we went out all around the Middle East. We went to Russia as well. But we spent a good 3 weeks in Iran. And I'm talking about camping now, and getting around amongst the real people. And that was my first experience of the country. But above and beyond that, I married an Iranian. And if you marry an Iranian by whom you have 4 children, 3 of whom I'm pleased to say speak quite reasonable Farsi, the 4th one never had so much of a chance to learn Farsi by going there regularly enough to do so. But if you marry an Iranian, you have your family, and you have also close links with an Iranian family, you sort of marry the country as well. And I took the country on, and I mean, politics don't come into this at all. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, people sometimes say, I have this motive and I have that motive and so on. My only motive actually is, first of all, being to boost up and to help and to improve the position and the pride and the prestige and the morale of Iranians in exile. Now we're getting to the stage which we've just been discussing, where really they're doing quite well enough, thank you. They don't need me. But on the other hand, I still can help be with them to be able to do things for them. I can still be a resident player in the country of their adoption, and also hopefully a resident player with American Iranians who might want to come through Biba and do business activities with us here. So one has a role. But it's a role purely for the country. It always has been, and it always will be. And everybody on all sides of the political fence has always known this. I've never made any secret of it whatsoever.
What do you like mostly about Iranianness or so?
Oh, I like the people, obviously. As I said, I've been married for 37 years to an Iranian woman, and it's been a very